I'm Jake.
I'm Fox.
I'm East Coast Polishing.
And as they all know, I'm the Foxy Detailer.
Today we're going to be polishing out something called a BAT, a bat. We're going to be making this bat polished. It's going to be shiny as can be. I'm going to be doing the entire sanding process, and Fox is going to be doing
the buffing.
She's going to be working on pulling out my sanding marks. As I've been doing this for a while, I have the know-how to how to get all these mill lines out of here. She's working on learning the knowledge and gaining it, so she's going to be taking notes from me as I'm doing it. I'm going to thoroughly explain how I'm pulling these mill lines out for a complete beginner, and then I'm going to walk her through the entire polishing process. I believe the polishing process is probably the easier portion of it, but the sanding is what makes your polish do the action. If you don't have good sanding, you're not going to have good polishing. All right, guys, so a key thing I like to mention on anything that we're polishing or dealing with, you want to watch a lot for labeling. So the first thing I noticed on us, we do have labeling. If this was a vinyl, you would see me actually peeling the vinyl off, and any of that adhesive that's left behind, I would be using the gum and tar remover with a microfiber to remove all that off. Sometimes you can look into more of a Scotch-Brite pad too with the gum and tar. That's going to get rid of any adhesive that you might have left over. Something like this, it's more of looks like a kind of an ink on it or something like that, so it does sand off with ease. But anything you're polishing that might have any kind of sticker or anything like that, you really don't want to sand it because it's going to very quickly pack up your pad and you're going to be wasting sandpaper. The easiest way I've found is just to peel it, spray it, wipe it, and then go about your sanding process. So the device we have here that we're holding this in is called a jaw horse. These are available at a lot of local hardware stores. A lot of places have them. You can look it up. It's a jaw horse. It's how I have it clamped in. A lot of polishers use this tool. I'm starting out with what I believe is going to work, which is 600 grit. I know I'm going to bind up a little bit of paper with the decals here. That's one thing to keep in mind. The biggest key to rotary sanding is keeping moving throughout the entire piece. Obviously, I'm going to have issues moving because I have part of the bat in my jaw horse. So that's going to be my biggest problem. So you're going to see me doing all different start and stop points throughout this bat while I'm working out the mill lines, constantly moving. Any stop points will create some kind of divot in the bat and possibly create an imperfection in the polish. So as you see me moving, focus on my start and stop points. I never stop at the exact same point, and I always keep a thorough movement. We're going to start sanding. An important thing with sanding is PPE. We're just doing this for demonstration purposes. So me personally as a pro, 5 seconds without a mask is not going to kill me. So as you saw, I came through here, I was able to remove a lot of that. I used 600 grit on a rotary sander. You can use a DA. My rotary, I was running in a speed anywhere between 26 and 3,000 RPMs. I find to be the most proficient, but as polishers, you're gonna learn to understand that you have to find the speed that's gonna work for you. For sandpaper, I say keep it below 3,500 RPMs. Anything above there, you're gonna be going through a lot of unnecessary use of paper. On these end caps, anything small like this, it's got a nice rounding to it. Something like that, you're really going to want what we call an interface pad. Even throughout the bat, it's going to help you if you're using a rotary sander. The interface pad has a piece of foam in it. It's going to give you a little give, so your start and stop points won't be as noticeable or even seen. It's going to help not let the edge of this hard backing pad dig in. When you do out this rounded end on a DA or a rotary, I still recommend using an interface pad. The interface pad is going to give that give so that the sandpaper can now take shape to what that rounded end is. So that's a key point to keep in mind when sanding. Another sanding product you're going to want to look into is an interface pad, which is a soft piece of foam that can be found online. And then it helps with any type of sandpaper, whether you're using 180 all the way up to 600. So for an intricate area like this back here, as a beginner, you don't want to always come into it as fast as you were going here. Something like this area is somewhere where you can catch very easily and create some kind of imperfection. So if you are going to go about this with a rotary sander, don't be afraid to slow it down and take this at a slower speed. Somewhere in the area of 2,000, 1,800 RPMs is still proficient. It's just going to take a little more time to work around a rounded end like this. If you're using a DA sander with an interface pad, as I have here, you're actually going to have a lot of ease going over this compared to someone with a rotary. I recommend a DA to a lot of the beginners just with the ease of use. It is a little bit slower for the idea of getting rid of the mill lines That is where it's not opposed to stop down to like a 320 grit with a DA versus the 600. 600 on a rotary is very aggressive with removing material versus a DA takes a little more time to remove material. After I get done with my 600 grit step, I'm gonna step into my 800. This is a great step for beginners to take into consideration. The reason being is it's a lot easier to remove with the actual buff itself. 600 grit is removable with our orange airway at 3,500 RPMs, but for the simple reason being, a beginner's gonna have a lot more ease of removing that with 800 grit involved. So now I'm starting on the 800 grit sandpaper. The reason being for this paper, again, as I said earlier, is to make it for the ease of polishing. It's gonna make it a lot simpler for a beginner to pull out any of these sanding marks. As we know, Amber is our beginner in this situation, and she's gonna wanna learn the easiest way to remove marks. That's one of the key points. So we're gonna start with 800 grit. Again, I'm gonna be around the same RPMs. I'm gonna start on this back piece, that's where I ended. You're gonna see me at a lower RPM, and then you're gonna see me jump up somewhere in that 2,800, 3,000 RPM range. All right, so for our beginner Amber, I'm gonna start her off with showing her what we're using for a buff. So the buff aluminum, typically my go-to from East Coast Polishing, on a 35 or a variable speed machine is what I'm gonna start any beginner out on. The buff she's gonna be starting with is a double stitch orange. Double stitch orange, you have to start with a raking process. When they're brand new, they're not gonna be broken in black like this. It's going to have very stiff and firm edges that aren't broken up. To break them up, we simply take a rake. Sometimes, for a beginner, I like to lower the RPM around 2,200. I will put the rake onto the handle of the grinder and I will let the rake actually eat into the buff. Here, I'm gonna demonstrate that for you. Raking is something we perform to open up the buff, clean it, and make it so our compound is gonna absorb into the fibers of the buff. Now, the time to do it when you're buffing is when it starts turning a very silver. You're gonna have a fine silver around the edges of your buff, and that's when you really should break it up again. Raking, you're gonna notice, is performed a lot less on your cut buff. Your finish buff, you're going to be doing a lot more raking. Nearly every time you pick up your finish buff, you should toss a very quick rake into it. Cutting, we're generally gonna perform cutting our aluminum at around 3,500 RPMs, and adding the rouge to it, you use less than you would think. Here I'm gonna show you how much I'm gonna add to do out a short section here, and then we're gonna introduce Amber, and we're gonna have her try holding the grinder, and I'm gonna show you guys how the grinder should be held while you're buffing. Let me add some rouge, and then we're gonna get into that. Now that my rouge is added to my buff and to my piece, I'm going to show you guys how you should be grinding. You should have a hand on the handle, trigger. You don't like locking as a beginner because if it gets away, you want to be able to release the trigger so the machine stops spinning. You're going to want to keep the bottom of the grinder some odd low. That way you're not riding up here. If you ride like this when you're buffing, the grinder is going to want to run away from you. If you keep it down here and you get in a comfortable position and are able to move with it, the grinder is not going to want to run as bad on you. It's going to have a harder time catching this buff and getting away from you. But again, as I've stated, polishing is all about comfort. You have to find a position that's going to work for you, whether it's getting low, sitting in a chair, or possibly even maybe you do like it risen a little bit. But what I have found from myself doing this as a pro, most people enjoy having the grinder handle high, bottom low, and moving in fluent motions. So I'm going to get started cutting on this side, and then we're going to show you a demonstration of Amber cutting on this side. All right, so as I started with before, it's all about positioning when it comes to polishing and comfort. So I'm gonna tell her, Fox is gonna be aware, when she comes in here, she's gonna have her hand on the handle, one hand on the bottom side. She does not wanna hold the grinder like this, because when you do it like this, it's gonna wanna run on you. She's gonna try and start a little lower on this bat and work up to where it's not polished. She's already loaded up with compound. You guys saw earlier how I added it with the buff sideways, and you wanna add your compound actually just behind your handle. If you go in front of your handle, it's gonna wanna pull the rouge out of your hand. If you're adding behind the handle, you're not gonna get that yanking action that this buff will give you when it spins. You can add compound at a lower speed if you don't feel comfortable adding at 3,500, but when you do cut, you're gonna want that speed of 3,500 RPMs to put the heat into the metal to get those sand marks to disappear. So she is going to come in at 3,500. It doesn't matter if there's a little 15 degree. I tell everyone 15 degrees is okay. Whether it's in here, whether it's twisting, whether it's an angle like this with the bottom, either way is fine as long as it's only about 15 degrees. Anything more than that, you're doing kind of an unnecessary motion, and you could risk cutting with more that's not a broken down fiber out of the buff. So she's gonna start over here. She's gonna work over. If she feels it's too much movement for her, she can go in a smaller section, like right here, 3 inches, and you can do a little spot at a time and go across. But the important thing is if you do the little sections, she's gonna wanna blend it all together at the end with one fluent motion. There is a medium amount of pressure you're gonna be putting in when you're cutting. You're not going to be laying on the grinder, but you wanna put a little something of pressure into it. Every step of the polishing process, we use a little less pressure as we go. Another important key point in polishing is as you do your pass with your black line, you don't wanna move up every time you go back. You're going to do it, I consider it calling it a staircase, stepping with 2 feet at a time. For a beginner, you're gonna want that extra heat, and the slow, tight passes is gonna get you the best result. So you're going to go across, back, go up. You can start from either side, but you're always gonna follow your first pass back before you move up.
So as a beginner, one of the things I struggle with the most is positioning and just finding that comfort spot. A lot of the time, I'm not gonna lie, like when I first start, I have a hard time not feeling awkward. So you'll see me, like I'll try to set up and like I'll do like a fake pass and I'll see if that's comfortable for me. This wasn't too bad. I was kind of thought it up more in my head, and when I got into it, it was a lot easier than I thought it was gonna be.
So overall, it came out really good. She did a great job at removing all of the sanding marks. She put in a good amount of pressure and a good amount of speed, and that's the big thing you gotta check.
Another tip for my beginners, as I'm going, sometimes I get like information overload, and just take a deep breath and focus on the task. If you notice that you're starting to get like a little bit ahead of yourself, just take a breath, slow down, and really get that nice shift in your hips and find your motion.
All right, so now in our polishing process, we're gonna step down. This is a UBM buff with Q36. I'm running this at 2200 RPM. Before I get in with this buff, I'm gonna wanna get a good rake. The reason being for this, we're gonna add a little color and depth into our piece here. We're also with this gonna be using it as more of a cleanup and to knock down the hash. So you're not gonna be adding as much material or as much compound as you did for your cut. You're going to be giving it a good swipe from the inside all the way to the outside of your buff. That way you're ensure that the entire buff is covered with it. Something like this, we're gonna start, and you're not gonna be using as much pressure as you did with your cut. So the goal is to go through it once, knock down your hash. The next one is gonna be cleaning it up, and on your second pass with it, you're gonna be using the least amount of pressure. After this, we're gonna follow it up with some Easy Red on a microfiber, and then after that, we're gonna be hitting it with some purple. Again, this buff is rated at 2200 RPMs for this procedure. You're gonna see me go through a section, and then we're gonna have Amber go through a section. One of the major advantages to using the Q36 over the normal green compound is with the Q36, if I do find that there's a slight sand mark or a slight imperfection or a blemish that I don't like, with Q36 I can speed this grinder up to 3500. And with this white buff and a little bit extra Q36, I can cut out that blemish that I find. After that, I would go back to slowing down the grinder, and I would restart the process in a fluent motion, trying to smooth all those hash marks out and get it cleaned right up. So to start, we're gonna add a little bit of rouge to Amber's buff. Remember, when you add rouge, you're always gonna wanna add behind the handle. I'm gonna do it for her just for the ease and for the video. Anyway, start the buff. That right there is about all you need for compound. There's not a lot that goes into this process, as I said. Now she's gonna start her process, going from one end to the other. The same process of over one pass, back and up. You're only gonna move at 1/8 inch to 1/4 inch increments. If you go to a 1/2 inch, you're gonna be skipping some kind of material, and you will see it in your finishing process.
So like when I was doing this first pass, it was fine, but I know as I start to come up, because you're changing your position, you're changing your stance, that's when I'm gonna have a hard time, and I'm just trying to find what works for me to catch that so it's not going like that, it's going more smooth.
So the next step in our process is gonna be using a product called Easy Red. Easy Red is what I like to do before I apply finisher. Finishing can be tough to find a black line as you go because it doesn't have a lot of grease in it. grease
Yeah,
content
like
in the
1.3
rouge.
K in
So the
there,
rouge
yeah.
isn't going to leave you a large black line to be able to
Trying
follow to
block
see where you
this
have been and
person,
where you
but I
haven't
don't
been.
think he's got enough
So a nice thing I like to
service.
do is
There
take
we
Easy
go.
Red, which is packed with sealant properties. When using Easy Red, it's extremely important to remember to close your nozzle before you shake it. You're going to flip your bottle upside down and shake it. If you flip it upside down, open your nozzle, and then you are going to spray it on the rag. You're going to saturate your microfiber, then you will come over to your part. You're going to saturate your part with 1 to 2 sprays, and then you will spread it on your part to go with your hash. So on a part like this, you're going to see me going back and forth. Once your Easy Red is applied to your product, it actually has a great flash time on it. Once it is applied, if you go right in and buff it off, it's going to have more of a smearing action, and your sealant properties, I've noticed, don't bond as well. If you let it harden up for 30 seconds to about a minute to 2 minutes, depending on the sunlight and heat you're in, that's what affects the flash time. You're gonna see it actually start to harden up and turn more of a silver finish. When it turns to that silver finish and it's hardened up, that's when it wipes off with ease. So now I'm actually gonna start the full finishing process. We're gonna have Amber perform this task. This task I feel like is the most important piece of it. If you want that extra pop and luster, that's where your purple is gonna come in. It's a Show Shine Purple bar from Renegade Products again. This is going on our white super finish buff. This buff is pretty new introduced. I think it does the best job out of our buff selection for knocking down the hash and giving you the most perfect finish we can. This buff is going to be run at a speed of 1800 RPMs as max. The most minimum we're going to run is around 1200, 1400. With this is going to be also taking off the Easy Red. With the Easy Red, you're going to be able to see where you were on this piece. You're going to be going in small light. It should be one step from top to bottom. You shouldn't have to go over it twice. If you feel like you would like to, there's no reason you can't. So to finish this out, we have a little bit of compound sticking here. At the end of our process, we'll take something called whiting powder. A little bit goes a long way. You're gonna dab just a little bit onto your microfiber. The reason we're using whiting powder and not our dissolver is because we're at our finishing stages here. If we use dissolver is actually gonna take off a lot of those sealant properties that we've added to this aluminum here. That's not something we typically would wanna do. The whiting powder is gonna have the least chance of scratching our actual finish here, and it's gonna do a really nice, easy job of removing any kind of built-up compound that we might have going on this piece right here. So we're gonna take it with very little pressure, just rub back and forth with our hashing direction across this here. Looking beautiful already for our finish. Adding no extra scratches to it, and we're leaving all of our chemical properties on here. But it did a phenomenal job at removing it without adding any kind of extra scratches, hashes, or taking off that chemical coating for us. That is the Renegade's whiting powder.